Okay, we are broadcasting now, so should start to see folks filter in.
Cool. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today to talk about how we can build prison abolition for a healthier Southwest. I'm really excited to learn from our panelists today, which we'll introduce shortly. Just wanted to acknowledge that I'm speaking today on stolen land from the Goshute, Ute, and Shoshone tribes. So just want to honor the indigenous roots here, now called Salt Lake City, Utah, from where I am. My name is Brinley. I'm one of the co-founders of Decarcerate Utah, and I'll be co-moderating with Cecia here, who will get into the introductions.
Hi, everyone. Happy Saturday. Thank you for joining us. Like Brinley said, my name is Cecia Dominguez Lopez. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm also a collective member of Decarcerate Utah. And thank you for joining us. Before getting started, we did want to point people to maybe think of celebrating this colonial holiday by donating to the Black Hills Bill and Legal Defense Fund. For those folks that aren't aware, there was a group of folks, land defenders, who stopped 45th from coming into Lakota land without permission, without consent, right? So folks are currently detained, and you can follow the NDN Collective on Instagram, Twitter, other platforms, or Google the Black Hills Bill and Legal Defense Fund. And that's one way to kind of think about how do you participate in abolition, right? So when we're thinking about abolition, we're also thinking about the dismantling of systems of domination, which definitely includes the settler colonial state, which includes borders, citizenship, patriarchy, white supremacy, all these big systems, capitalism, that we're going to get into talking today. I'll stop there, and we're gonna we are joined by our panelists, Antonio, Tomas de la Garza, and Uyen. I'm gonna let folks introduce themselves, introduce the work that they do, and as part of the introduction, also kind of talk about what does abolition mean to you, and how does it show up in your work?
You want to start, or?
If you want to get us started, Dr. Antonio.
Okay. Hello there. I'm Dr. Antonio Tomas de la Garza. I'm a professor at California State University San Marcos in the communication program. San Marcos is a Hispanic serving institution. It's located about 30 miles from the US-Mexico border in Tijuana, and we're about 15 miles from the US Border Patrol checkpoint on the California 5. So our population is literally squeezed between two border checkpoints. And because of the relationship between the US Border Patrol and their jurisdictions, our population that we work with has a very different schedule of rights when it encounters Border Patrol than, say, groups in the mainland. Border Patrol can set up checkpoints. They commonly roll with local police departments to do warrants, investigations. They refer to that as collateral damage, or collateral, if they pick up people who are undocumented while just being engaged with the police. And my research is primarily focused on the US-Mexico borderlands. I look at the violence that happens when people are incarcerated by Border Patrol, the violence required just to maintain the US-Mexico border. And then the other part of my work is I try and show the human face of people who are criminalized by US Border Patrol and immigration policies. And so a lot of my work focuses on individual narratives of surviving and sometimes not surviving US Border Patrol practices. How does abolition show up in my work and why is it important? I think that the state system, especially for me, this is referring to the US border, is one of the most cruelly violent systems of control. The US border has been intentionally designed in the way that enforcement happens to force people into the deepest, most dangerous parts of the desert, so that most people crossing, right, if they get across, they're very, how to put it, they're resilient, they're able-bodied, they're physical, they make great laborers for this country. If you don't fit that, the US border is designed to kill you. And it's designed to kill you in such a way that Border Patrol and immigration, they can keep their hands clean. They can say the environment has taken its course. The US Border Patrol destroys millions of miles of trails, water catches, uproots local indigenous plants, all to make the border more dangerous so that they can continue to murder people as they come across without having to own any of that. That's where abolition comes from in my work. I think borders need to be abolished. I think the state as a system that is predicated on a monopoly on violence needs to be abolished. And with that, I mean policing. We're not just talking about policing in the borderlands. We're talking about policing in particular of bodies of color, of queer and trans bodies, all throughout the United States. And that policing is predicated on violence that police officers and the state can get away with without having to take any accountability or responsibility for that. My experiences that have kind of led me to this was actually doing my bachelor's and master's in Arizona back when SB 1070 got passed. SB 1070 was an immigration enforcement bill passed by the state of Arizona that legalized racial profiling, legalized profiling people based on linguistic abilities, accent, dress. So if you looked poor or if you looked like a laborer, all of those were justifiable reasons for the police to basically do a stop and frisk. They could stop you, they could demand identification for any contact that they had with people. It was used to target members of the Latinx community, though it was also, because in Flagstaff, we're a border town to a reservation, also used a lot to harass and stop members of the local indigenous, the Dene community down there. I watched friends get disappeared. I saw people get pulled out of cars, taken to detention, and then shipped away into a desert concentration camp, right, where they were months without having access to lawyers or representation. And that became both my political work and my activism and also my research. And now I teach classes on the border, I teach classes on immigration, and classes on social protest movements and how you go about making the kind of change that I think abolition work is about.
Great, thank you so much for sharing all of that and kind of highlighting that for a lot of us, this work is personal, right? There's these systems of policing, systems of domination affect a lot of people. So yeah, for a lot of us, the work is personal. And also thank you for highlighting that, you know, a lot of these things are by design, they're intentional. The practice of policing, the practice of domination is practiced, right? And we see it through laws and stuff and these systems. So yeah, I'll pass it on to our next panelist to introduce themselves.
Hello, everyone. My name is Uyen. I'm from so-called Salt Lake City, which is on what Brinley was iterating before, Occupy Shoshone, Goshu, and Uteland. I recently graduated from the University of Utah and I majored in environmental sustainability studies. Abolition was something that really was recently introduced into my work and studies as a volunteer at the University of Utah Prison Education Program, or UPEP. Basically what UPEP does is it helps facilitate college courses at both the state men's prison and also the state women's prison as well, so Wasatch and Timpanogos. And my role in that is I was a past intern, but I'm also a current volunteer, and I am basically a tutor or a TA, so I help facilitate classes to help them with their coursework and help them understand the materials within different courses that the students at the prisons are taking. And as someone who's really studying and focusing my career on climate justice, abolition is something that's also very heavily intertwined, because in order to achieve climate justice, you have to also abolish certain systemic institutions that are allowing fossil fuels and social injustice to continually be perpetuated. And one of those specific systems is the prison industrial complex. But again, that also goes hand in hand with the abolishment of other systems that Antonia also brought up. A lot of those things are also like the systemic policing that we have in various different forms throughout our country and the world. And then also something that's also often brought up in the rhetoric of climate justice is also abolishing capitalism and the various branches within that as well. And I am also currently a fellow at Uplift Climate.
Awesome. Thank you both for those introductions. Now we want to get a little bit more into kind of the geography and the context of where you're working and how that ties into climate justice work and prison abolition. So we'll start with Uyen, if you want to go first this time, and then we'll start with Antonio for the next question. But we'll give time for both of you to answer that.
Yeah, so the question, I'm sorry, was how geography was intertwined with abolition, our work. Yeah, so one specific way that our geography is intertwined with abolition here in Salt Lake is a current example is the relocation of the state prison that is currently underway. And the relocation of the Utah State Prison is also helping lay ground for the inland port that's also going to be built as well. And those things are very much intertwined in how they're affecting the environment, but also how they're affecting the health and well-being of people who are incarcerated. The prison system, basically, those who are incarcerated, they're allowing for those who are incarcerated to be susceptible to a lot of climate catastrophes, and that typically is within their access to like clean water, clean air, to land that's accessible to them, and then also to quality food as well. And the relocation is going to be built upon previously undeveloped land. And a lot of this is going to basically cause, basically increase a threat to the local biodiversity of that land, also to the accessibility of the clean waters that we have there. And it's also going to drastically impact our air quality. And those who have traveled in Utah or are currently from Utah are very well aware of the air quality in Utah and typically how poor it can be. And with the relocation of the prison, that is also intertwined with the building of the inland port, our air quality is going to be increasingly worsened due to the traffic and the construction, and to basically what the inland port is going to be serving, as well as the prison industrial system.
Thank you. Antonio, do you want to talk about where you're at and how the local context ties into your work?
Yeah. And first, I just want to touch on something you talked about the production of prisons and how that affects communities. You know, in envisioning an abolitionist future, one large barrier is just how profitable and powerful prisons make the United States. You know, we have a country with 5% of the world population and 25% of the incarcerated individuals worldwide, making the United States the most incarcerated country in the world. And there are good reasons for that. If you assume that the system is working as it's supposed to. A big part of that is that prisons make a lot of money. States and cities compete for the opportunity to incarcerate human beings in their geography because it's so profitable, right? And one thing that I think the abolitionist movement really has to start looking at is the fact that prisons become places where slave labor is more or less legalized, right? Where states and communities profit. And we're not just talking about at the macro, you know, prison guard jobs, prison admin jobs bring a lot of money into communities that otherwise don't have economic opportunities. And really kind of undoing that link between the prison system and the profit system, I think, is huge. You know, shifting to the borderlands, you know, here in North County, San Diego, we have some of the most highly surveilled, highly policed populations in the country. The United States Border Patrol here has the right to set up random border checks, to do sweeps. They often engage in using false warrants in order to gain access to people's homes, in order to ask them about their immigration status. In fact, I was running a training with a local immigration attorney for one of my student organizations last year. And I mean, a common tactic is even to have plainclothes police and immigration officers waiting outside of Mexican restaurants, hardware stores. You say hello to them, and a question they often like to ask is like, "That's a really interesting accent. Where are you from?" Right? And just engaging in that much conversation can give a Border Patrol agent the necessary justification, excuse, to begin demanding identification. So the role of surveillance and policing in these populations in this geographic area is, I mean, it's monstrous. We also have, you know, immigration and ICE agents attached to gang enforcements. The local area has some of the largest gang injunctions in the country. For those of you who don't know what a gang injunction is, it's a geographic location that has been targeted as being gang-ridden. The state uses public nuisance laws to impose curfews, and particularly those curfews are targeted at young men of color. If you or anyone that you live with or associate with, we're even talking to the point like your cousins or your neighbors, people who share an apartment block with you, are in the gang database, you were put into that database as an associate. You have a different schedule of rights when it comes to stop, search, and seizure. And these two mechanisms, right, structures of policing and controlling bodies, make this space very, very dangerous for people of color. You know, California is a blue state, but it still kills a lot of people of color. Their police kill a lot of people of color. LA County's budget is in the billions for policing, right? And all of this is done, I think, very intentionally to ensure that there is a controllable, docile, afraid population of workers. because it's also not coincidental that the biggest economic driver in California is agriculture. California agriculture is a much bigger deal in terms of profit than Hollywood, for example. And so all of these forces come together to regulate labor and keep people afraid.
Yes, thank you for bringing up those connections about how labor and capitalism and jobs and labor prison infrastructure are very connected. Someone in the chat brought up Ruth Wilson Gilmore's Golden Gulag. So for folks that are unfamiliar, definitely recommend checking out her book and kind of looking at the history of how prisons, where are prisons built and why do they get built, right? And related to what Antonio was saying, a lot of the places that these prisons were built in either towns that used to be agricultural centers or centers for the military industrial complex, right? So they were towns where, because of the end of the agricultural business or the end of the military business, folks were left out of jobs. And so these prison constructions kind of came in as a solution, right? Like, you have folks here, they need jobs, let's build a prison. So really making those connections between the geography and the infrastructure, yeah, it's very important. We're gonna go deeper into kind of how land and surveillance and domination are tied. So for our Uplift fellow, I think kind of connecting some of what you're learning about climate justice movements and abolitionist movements, we're just wondering if you had any insights to share. What can the abolitionist movement learn from the climate justice movement, vice versa? Do you see folks working together or not? You know, yeah, if you can just kind of share a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So something that I've kind of been realizing in a lot of like my social and academic circles is that the conversation around climate change is typically the question, how can we decrease X, Y, and Z before we reach the 2 degrees Celsius increase? But rather the question is never, how do we adapt to a world that is already past the tipping point? And I think it's important to frame the question like that because really the reality of climate change and the reality of the trajectory of our current planet approaching the tipping point, or rather already having surpassed it, is something that is rarely ever talked about, but something that needs to be discussed more so that we can understand ways in which we can, quote unquote, like adapt or solve and combat climate change from different perspectives. And in an article written by Jim Bendel called Deep Adaptation, one of the ways in which he talks about navigating the current trajectory of our climate catastrophe is the 3 R's. And within those 3 R's, they are resilience, relinquishment, and restoration. And with relinquishment, basically that requires us letting go of systems that are no longer working within our favor to combat climate change. And one of those exact systems is mass incarceration and the prison industrial complex. And really, climate activists need to start learning and observing, reading more on abolitionists that are either current or within our history, to learn about the same tools that abolitionists have actually been using, because those same tools are what climate activists have also been using. Something that abolitionists throughout history, the mainstream has always considered them to be radical, and that they are doing work that is typically unthinkable. But ultimately, like, various abolitionists throughout our history have actually been successful, and were actually able to do something that was previously thought as unthinkable and very much against the mainstream. And a lot of these radical actions that abolitionists are demanding are that some of the wealthiest people give up their wealth and capital. And climate activists actually want the same thing as well, if you view it in that perspective. And it's basically wanting those who are wealthiest to redistribute that same wealth, and to also abolish capitalism and the means that keep it alive. And so abolitionists throughout history have been instigating, they've been disrupting, and they've been using persuasion as tools to help them achieve abolition. And those are the same exact tools that climate activists need to be using as well. And so I think there's actually quite a bit of overlap between a prison abolitionist or an abolitionist in general, whether it is someone who is advocating to abolish the police state or different corrupt systems within our society, and climate activists. And then again, those things are also very much deeply intertwined with prison abolition and climate change as well. And so I think that's something that a lot of climate activists also forget, because they focus so narrowly on the purely scientific and environmental aspects of it, of how we can decrease our fossil fuel emissions and different numbers and statistics within the science of climate change, but also they're forgetting the social justice aspect of it as well, and that you can't achieve climate justice if you also do not achieve racial or gender justice as well. And so because all of these things are so deeply intertwined, really a lot of climate activists are coming out and being more vocal about abolition in general, because they're realizing that it's actually the same exact work.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for pointing out how these systems are very interconnected. And that's definitely something that I've been reflecting on as abolition has become more mainstream, and we're uplifting certain work. Sometimes we're forgetting folks that work outside of, abolishing prisons or abolishing police, but are maybe doing land rights, or, like even the folks who took over land, yesterday. And so how a lot of folks who are doing anti-colonial or anti-ICE, like anti-borders work, are also abolitionists, but maybe don't get labeled as such, just because of how sometimes our movements get talked about. But yeah, we're gonna talk about more about geography and the borderlands. And this question is for Antonio. So can you talk more about how we must think about dismantling the gender binary, dismantling heteronormativity, as we work to dismantle these violent and carceral systems, right? So how is border abolition part of the work that you do to highlight and build healthy and caring communities for trans migrants?
Thank you. I think that's such an important question. I think it's fundamentally one of the places where I think abolitionist and environmental advocacy work intersects. And I think it starts with really reframing our understanding of justice. In terms of, the United States, we've got a retributive system or understanding of justice, right? And that is, there are bodies, people that have been criminalized, that are viewed as abject, whose life and death aren't worthy of grieving. And as a result, we let them pay the costs, whether that's the cost of monitoring and controlling and keeping a docile state, right? Which is what the policing system in the United States is about. It is about protecting privacy, ensuring that the working class never actually has enough power to disrupt the status quo, and maintaining, right, the wealth and property, right, of the ruling class. Now, environmental justice is really facing the exact same threat and the exact same tactics, right? The police are brought out using tear gas, hoses, dogs on environmental activists, right? The same mechanisms of control that are used to police bodies of color, that are used to police trans and queer bodies, that are used to police those people who we consider, the United States considers, abject. So one of the very first places that I feel like these two groups really come to connect is the need to dismantle the violence that undergirds policing and justice in this society, right? Absent removing that violence, that will always be a tool that those in power have to dissuade, right, real change. And so I think one of the crucial keys for both people doing decolonial work, environmental work, is to remove the tools and the weapons that the police have, right? Secondarily, when we think of owning a thing, when we think of systems of control, when we think of power, that power is, because of the way we've been conditioned to the state, rooted and predicated on violence, right? One of the primary things that make a state a legitimate state is a monopoly on violence, meaning no other group or organized body within that area can hurt more people, produce more death, or do more damage than the state, right? And the state uses that, one, to control and protect property and space, right? But also to discipline and regulate bodies. And that discipline has almost always come at the cost for people of color and trans people, right? If you deal with every other externalized factor, trans people of color are the most likely to be the victims of murder, the most likely to be the victims of violence. The average age of a trans person of color in the United States right now is something like 30 years old, right? And those populations, those bodies, in the same way that indigenous bodies during the colonization and the conquest, in the same way that Black bodies during slavery, during Jim Crow, and now are viewed as abject, right? As there to be sacrificed, there to be controlled, and by our politicians and our leaderships, totally ungrievable, right? Not worth caring about, not worth recognizing the value of those lives. If you were gonna undermine this system of power, right? The pin that upholds both environmental racism, colonization, heteropatriarchy, anti-trans violence, immigration violence, police murders of Black people, you have to first confront this fact that in our culture and in our society, there are lives that matter more than others. There are bodies that we have as a collective a responsibility to grieve, and there are bodies that our culture has told us don't count. There are lives that don't matter. And so, you know, for me and my work, and this is also why I feel so closely tied to abolition, is it's in showing that trans lives matter, immigrant lives matter, Black lives matter. And you have to get people to make that shift in their consciousness to be outraged when they see violence committed against those people, right? To feel a moral responsibility to act, right, against that injustice, if you're gonna see change either in abolition or in environmental racism. And so I think that's where, like, the first step is that in recognizing and valuing those lives. And I would say if we wanted to go even beyond to like what justice should look like post-abolition, right? It is one in where you take into account the lack of power or the relationship to power of the people in the situation as you begin to think about justice, which means where does justice come to who does justice come to first? Or where is our collective responsibility to which people? And I think that starts by looking at those groups who have paid the butcher bill for American prosperity, right? Whose lives continue to be sacrificed for capitalism, for profit. And you gotta make them the center. You've gotta make them the priority in any type of uplift or social justice organizing. You start with them. Because if you can make the world better for them, if you can make the world safer for them, right, the rest of us will still benefit, right? But you cannot bring real radical change if you're worried about the people like many of us, right? Digital natives, first worlders, many of us with degrees and educations. The struggle can't be about us, right? And so our work and our voices have to amplify those who are marginalized. And for me, I start with trans migrants as one of the most at-risk populations, one of the most ignored populations. And so that's why my work focused so heavily on them.
Thank you so much for sharing your insight there. Yeah, I think the main takeaway is that no one's disposable in a climate justice movement, and prison abolition is totally a key component of that. So thanks for expanding on that. I want to share a quote from Andrea Ricci and give you some time for our panelists to respond to it, just sharing your thoughts. 1 second, let me pull it up. And oh, Cecia's got it on her screen. All right, so we think of police as being there to protect the vulnerable or protect people who are targeted by violence. If you show police officers consistently where Black women, women of color, or LGBT people of color are concerned, ignoring violence, telling people that they deserved what happened, assuming that they're a threat, that they committed the violence, or perpetrating violence against them, then the myth that they're about protecting victims of violence or vulnerable people starts to unravel. And when we get a clearer picture that they actually don't change their stripes when they're responding with violence. They're still policing race, they're still policing gender, they're still policing sexuality, they're still policing poverty. They're saying victims of violence who are outside of a very small group, middle-class white women who are not trans, are not deserving of protection. So we'll start, I'll turn that over to Uyen first to just kind of share your thoughts on that and how that relates to your work, and then Antonio, if you don't mind sharing a response.
I think this quote is very reflective of a lot of the rhetoric we're hearing around abolishing the police state right now, and that's just because the police state is working, just as many of us have heard, exactly the way in which it was intended to, and that it is only serving to protect the small number of people that society has told us that their life has value, such as Antonio was also reflecting beforehand. And I think this is also important in the discussion of abolition, because abolishing our prison systems also means defunding and abolishing the police, because they're so deeply intertwined in how they work with one another to be able to perpetuate each other's systems and the way in which they work. With abolition work as well, the reason why prisons need to be abolished is because essentially we cannot put in force an oppressive system that is going to continually oppress others, which is the prison system that is oppressing those who are typically the most oppressed in our communities. Something that Ruth Wilson Gilmore actually has talked about is that the places where inequalities are the deepest typically have the greatest use of prison and punishment. And that is something that is really, that we see so much within our country, with those who are most at risk typically being the most heavily policed, and inequalities within that, and the inequity within that as well. And I think that really this should really move people to think about the systems in which can replace the current police state, and replace or completely abolish what is currently serving as our prison system, and how they're really one, working exactly how this white supremacist state has intended it to work, but also how which we can enforce a different system that is actually going to do the work that we want it to do, and which is going to help those who are most at risk receive their necessary needs that they need in their everyday life, in order to deter them from the moment in which they mess up. And this basically is going to require us funneling more money and time and workers into different social programs that are really going to help provide these resources to those who are within vulnerable communities. And a lot of these things are typically just the bare necessities that all of us need in order to live a precious life. And those are just, it's going to be therapy, it's going to be quality food, it's going to be access to education, but it's also going to be equal access to everything within society that we need in order to flourish and thrive. Those were my initial thoughts, just thinking about that quote.
Thank you. Antonio, do you want to share your reflections?
Sure. There's a lot to unpack there. I think it's a great quote. One of the first things that I started thinking about was just the relationship between safety and policing is actually inverted. Lots of times during this conversation out in abolition, people keep coming back to well, what does it look like? What does the world look like without the police, right? Can that even be possible, right? Go to any upper class suburb, right? And you see a world without police. You see a world where the carceral violence, right, and the need to discipline and control and police bodies doesn't exist. What do you have there, right? And we're gonna take race out of it. You can't actually take race out of it, but let's say you take race out of it, right? What is it that is in that community that changes that community's dynamic, right, in relationship to crime? And that is, these are communities with enough. They're people who are bought into their community. They have a home, they have a family, they have jobs, they have hopes for their future, they have access to education, they have access to therapy, they have access to emergency services. These are what communities without policing look like. And it's very, very possible to produce those communities if you're willing to invest. That's one of the things that I think has been so great about the defund movement that's happening, I would say alongside. I don't necessarily want to say it's the same as the abolition movement, but that really, if you take money away from violence and instead invest that money in communities so that people have a stake and have hope, they don't need to commit crime, right? They have reasons beyond the threat of violence for participating and making their communities whole, safe places where people want to live. So that's one, right? Police do not make communities safer. Community makes communities safer. Wealth makes communities safer. Access to support makes communities safer. The other part of this quotation that I think is really interesting, and it made me think about, immediately, I thought of Amy Cooper, right? when I saw that video in Central Park, like, there were chills. She knew in that moment, when she was making that false report, that she could potentially end this man's life. She was threatening him with the violence of the state right before she actually began the process to introduce that violence into his life, right? And you got to ask yourself, how is it that this type of phenomenon has become so prevalent right now, when a world where we're discussing police abuse and violence and Black Lives Matter? Why is there a Karen hashtag trending, right? And I think a big part of it is that the police and the state need the myth of white innocence to justify itself, right? It needs to convince people, in particular white people, right, that the police is what keeps them safe, and that their communities are only safe and secure because of that violence. And that message is replicated by our politicians. It's replicated in almost every episode of Law and Order or any of those police procedural crime dramas. It has been inculcated in people since they've been in school, right? The school to prison pipeline exists, it's real, and it also teaches teachers and white students how to view men of color, right? It teaches them K through 12 that these are violent criminals who don't belong in civilized spaces like education, right? And so white people, and in particular, I think white women, middle-class white women, have been disempowered by patriarchy of their own personal power, and then been told that they can't be safe without a violent policing program designed to target different bodies to keep them safe. And we saw this with the very first abolition movement. You know, when white women were advocating, right, to increase the age of consent and protect themselves from predation, violence, and rape, typically at the hands of white Southern landowners, right? That wasn't the argument that they could get away with making. They had to make the argument that you have to protect us from these men of color, because the only people who could vote to protect white women were white men, the ones engaging in the predation, you know? And white men went along with this and perpetuated this narrative of the rapist and the black buck, right? That these people and populations had to be controlled or they would become a threat to white women. And right when abolition happens, policing in its modern form takes shape. And it takes shape under this, this guise of protecting white women from men of color, right? And in doing so, it gives whiteness a justification, a rock solid justification for the violence it produces, and makes white people feel like they can't be allies in the abolition strategy because then they stop being safe. That somehow safety is this zero sum where the safer community is from police violence, the less safe the members of that community might be from people of color, specifically men of color. But again, remember how trans people are policed, queer bodies are policed, also criminalized, impoverished bodies are criminalized, mentally ill bodies are criminalized. And so it's picking apart that matrix, right? That abolitionists need to undo the myth that police make anyone safer, right? If they're gonna make that change. And I think on the environmental side, you also see that. You know, early on when I was doing this work, environmentalists were in very many ways the enemies of abolition, at least for people on the US-Mexico border. The arguments about having and needing the state to preserve and protect this space, right? From people who were crossing, from people who were hiking, from people who were using these areas. put environmentalists and abolitionists at odds, right? And that's the other part, is I think we have to start undermining this notion that the state protects the environment too. The state doesn't protect the environment, right? The state makes sure that the environment is protected for the use by a certain class, right? Just like the state uses the police to protect the space of a certain class. And I think that's one myth that we really, as abolitionists and environmentalists, have to start addressing, right? The state doesn't make anyone safer. At best, the state externalizes that violence onto a different population. You know, yeah.
Thank you for that. There was a lot of you know, richness in what you were all the pieces that you were connecting, right? And I think I really appreciated you bringing in that a lot of these are really old narratives, right? The state, as we see it today, the settler colonial state, was designed to protect certain people, and those people were usually cis, wealthy, land-owning men, right? And to this day, we have a system that still kind of protects and centers the care of those folks at the center, right? So yeah, really appreciate you kind of highlighting how these are old stories. And we were joking before the panel started, we were kind of checking in about how are we taking care of ourselves in the apocalypse, right? And the apocalypse is also another word for unveiling or revealing, right? So I think a lot of what you were talking about is that we're seeing a lot of these stories, a lot of these myths that are really old myths, that it takes these interlocking systems to uphold them. And because of, you know, the first portal being COVID and the pandemic really kind of showing how the state does not take care of us, even when, even outside of the police, right, outside of safety, doctors or the medical system that is supposed to take care of us does not actually meet those needs under capitalism, right? So that kind of being the first portal, and then with the defund movement kind of showing again how really bringing forth what a lot of communities have always known, that these systems are not there to protect us, but again, because of what's happening, a lot of it is being unveiled, revealed to a much larger audience, right? Before we open it up to Q&A, was there just anything, any last thoughts, comments, you know, anything you all wanted to add before kind of opening it up for folks? And either of you can start, can jump in.
So I guess just kind of last thoughts, you know, if you do any type of reading into critical race theory, which is a big part of abolition studies, there's this notion of racial realism, right? And what it requires is that you take a honest look at the prevalence of racism in the very bones of the United States, and how even across history, we only see gains for people of color when those gains coincide with the interests of white people and the white population. And if you're making the focus of your struggle some kind of like policy point or legal change, it can be very disheartening and it can be very alienating, right? Because of the way our system works, even if you get rid of all the racism, right? The system itself is still a structure that is bigger than any one group of people. So how do we move forward knowing that we've got this huge obstacle, right? White supremacy, heteropatriarchy, homophobia, transophobia. We can't focus on, how to put it, we can't make the goals of this type of work any one specific goal. We have to make the goals of this type of work disruption and resilience, right? Even if we in this particular moment do not find a way to abolish policing, if this conversation leads, right, to people building resilience and people disrupting those institutions, this work has succeeded, right? Every dollar that gets taken out of a police department's pocket, every person whose mind is changed, everyone who joins this conversation, right, they're being disrupted, right? And that has got to be how we measure our success. And then the second part is, and are we building resilience in those communities and with those people that we work with? Are we making space to heal each other? Because healing is not going to come from the state, right? The rich are not going to give it up and make shit better for us, right? So how are we addressing and healing ourselves? And so, you know, I love radicalism. I'm a radical. I think the abolitionist radical politic that is happening right now is beautiful. I've also seen it before a lot in my history as an organizer and activist, right? And in order to sustain it, you need to be willing to understand that our goals here are disruption and resilience. And if we're doing that, we're making the change, even if it doesn't look like the rich people have collapsed, even if we don't solve white supremacy. So that's what I would leave y'all with.
Thank you. Uyen, did you want to close out with any final thoughts before we open to the Q&A?
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to piggyback off of what Antonio was just talking about in terms of measuring our progress with resilience and with disruption. And something that has been talked about heavily within social media, but also within the discussion of the work of Black Lives Matter and also abolition work is typically, I guess, who we should be looking to be leading this work. And I just wanted to also put out a reminder that in talking about resilience, the communities that have been the most resilient within this work are typically Black communities, Black women specifically, Black trans women, Black trans people in general. And along with that, it's also going to be Indigenous and Native people as well. And I think it's just a reminder that those who have been practicing resiliency for millennia and for centuries are going to be the ones leading this work, because they have practiced resiliency for generations and throughout their family lineage. And I think it's just a reminder that we should really be looking to these communities to be leading the work and to taking after their example to really help progress the work in order to achieve abolition work and in order to achieve Black liberation as well.
Yes, thank you so much for that. Wholeheartedly agree. I'm gonna go ahead and ask the first question. Can the panelists, especially Antonio, speak to the ways that humanities and literature, like the stories they publish about trans bodies of color, contribute to these abolition movements?
Thank you, Lily, for the question. You know, this comes down to like 3 words, right? Black Lives Matter. One of the ways that we begin to undo this work, and remember, like Ceci said, these are old narratives. These are old stories that are deeply rooted in our culture. We have to start telling better stories. We absolutely, as a culture and as a society and as activists, have to change the narratives, in particular the narratives that surround Black and trans bodies. Because those narratives are what justify the violence. Those narratives are what make them invisible when the violence occurs. Those narratives are what make their losses impossible for our society to grieve. Those narratives are why someone can look you in the eye and say, but all lives matter, right? And so for me, the reason I do the work I do, right? I'm in a very privileged position. I have a PhD. I live in Southern California. I'm a citizen. I'm a cis male. Not a lot of people really want to hear about my shit, right? And honestly, as far as privilege goes, I've got plenty. So what can I do with my privilege, right? I can lend that privilege to make sure that people who don't have access to the language that I have, or to the publication venues, or to the speaking venues, or to the educational venues that I have, that their stories get heard, right? I can speak alongside them, I can speak with them, and better yet, I can shut up and listen. And I think that's why the type of work I do with narrative and the type of work that we're seeing happen on social media right now with combating these narratives is so important, right? Because if you change the story, you change the way people perceive the event. And only when people stop perceiving these lives as disposable, right, are people going to work to preserve those lives.
Uyen, did you want to comment on that?
I'm sorry, I'm just rereading the question.
Oh, no worries. So speaking to the ways humanities and literature, like the stories they publish about trans bodies of colors, contribute to the abolition movement.
I think Antonio is very much more well versed in this than I am, to be totally honest. But humanities and literature and how it's published about trans bodies and of color to contribute to these abolition movements. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if it's just me. I'm not quite understanding this question very well. But I will say I currently don't have very much to add on top of Antonio's answer.
No worries. The next question then is from Jessica. Do you think that the other motive with the initial setup of policing and claiming BIPOC men are bad was also to get white women to buy into the patriarchy?
I mean, yeah, you know, patriarchy is a deep, fucked up hustle that has been perpetuated on this continent for a long time, right? And it is obvious and has been obvious for hundreds of years, right? How violent patriarchy is, how unfair it is, how damaging it is to men and women, right? But remember that systems like that exist because someone is getting something out of it, right? Despite all the damage patriarchy does, someone gets something out of it. And people who feel a deep investment in their gender role, and who have been fed narratives about men of color being violent, being bestial, being rapists, their identity and their safety is predicated on that lie, right? And when a deep portion of your identity and who you are is predicated on your vulnerability, the inability of your community, the unwillingness of your community to protect you, you're gonna go wherever there's a safe harbor, right? And that's one of the truly insidious tragedies, right, about how this framing and the policing of men of color and the myth of white innocence and heteropatriarchy work together, right, is that women are disempowered by men in their community. White women are victims of violence by their friends, their acquaintances, their family members. It is not the external threat, right? It is not the mad buck male assaulter. And as long as that story exists, the people who are actually committing the violence and the assaults get away with it. Because you're not gonna believe, a jury doesn't believe a person who says that their acquaintance, friend, or relative assaulted them, when our cultural narrative about how rape and assault happens is it is some other person of color, external predator that commits those actions, right? And so the way that that narrative gets twisted not only means that men of color are demonized and policed and harassed, but it also means that white violators, right, get a pass. And so I think it ties in very deeply to that sort of like, so if white violators get a pass and white women aren't safe in their communities, then the only chance they have of being safe is relying on the police. They can't go to their people. They can't go to another community. And so they're trapped. And I think being trapped like that means that you buy into these systems, or makes it easier to buy into these systems. And I also have to back that up and say, and I'm speaking from a position of a man who, aside from police, right, I get to walk wherever I want and feel safe. I don't live with that kind of fear, you know? So I can only see what I see from the outside, these moments like the Amy Cooper. But I don't have to live with the fear of being a woman in this society and in this culture. And I think it's very justified to be afraid as a woman being in this society and in this culture. You know, but fear is a tool of control, and it's a very effective tool of control. So that's how I would respond to that.
Yeah. I just wanted to add a little piece to that, because I think part of, to kind of speak to these like old stories and like the myth of innocence of whiteness, right? Like we also have to go, we have to go back. These are super old stories. And so if we're starting looking at these stories at colonization, we're actually missing a lot of the story, a lot of what had to happen, what had to be justified, so that, you know, white God-fearing men, you know, were able to justify going to other lands, taking ownership of those lands, taking ownership of people from those lands, right? So how do you justify that if you're a Christian? How do you justify that if you are, you know, a God-fearing citizen of the crown, right? And so a lot of these stories had to place, one, the land as non-human, as an object, that's something that you can extract from, and because doesn't have any being or sentience, you don't have to feel bad that you're harming it. And part of that logic was women, putting white women, right? When we start, if we look at the story, the birth story of the United States, women didn't get the right to vote until way later, right? And so it was still centering men. And so what stories had to happen to cement, you know, the patriarchy, capitalism, whiteness. I think you were talking about white people. For me, I think about it as whiteness, and whiteness being, you know, at least capitalism, heteronormativity, you know, citizenship, Christianity, all wrapped into like, this is what deserves care. These are the bodies that are non-disposable. And these stories, they were so good at exporting the story worldwide at such a long time ago, that this is what we're kind of dealing with, right? As a world right now, we see that defund the police movement is very connected to, you know, Palestinian liberation, to international struggles, because it's about, again, this logic of domination, this logic of whiteness. So yeah, just wanted to connect those pieces that like these myths are really old myths, and wanting to urge folks that yes, colonization is a very important key moment, but let's go back to how does whiteness get created? How does this myth of whiteness get upheld? And that, yeah, requires us to go back a little bit further. Were there any other questions, Brinley? I don't see them coming up on my end.
Uyen, did you want to take a stab at that question? I just
Yes, I just wanted to add to what Cecia and what Antonia were saying in terms of like what is upholding whiteness. And I think a lot of what is upholding that is identity politics as well. And it's going to be those who are white and those who have white privilege are going to want to do everything they can within their power to preserve that identity, right? To preserve that their identity of privilege, of class and wealth. And internally, they're going, I mean, as a result, they're really going to be criminalizing people of color and primarily Black men. And this absolutely you know, is a result of reinforcing patriarchy as well amongst women against people of color and particularly Black men as well, because they want to uphold this identity politics within themselves that that they hold a higher power than others, and they want to continually reinforce that because of the police state that we currently live within, and the police state that is teaching those who live within that society those same police tactics and how to police others as well. And through that, I think there's also something that we talk a lot of, that I've heard a lot about, which is a double consciousness. And that's basically particularly when people of color and particularly Black people are able to see a version of themselves through how they see other community members treating them. And again, this all kind of ties into identity politics and how that's really upholding white supremacy and white privilege, and then also perpetuating the patriarchy.
Yeah, something I read, I think it was from the Creative Interventions Toolkit actually, was about kind of this myth of white women being fearful of what happens outside of the home more than they're fearful of what happens inside of the home, even though statistically they are more likely to be harmed in the home. And that's, like many of you have reflected, that's part of the narrative shifting of like trying to like allocate that fear to other places that are not like in favor of white supremacy, and to keep women feeling like, white women specifically feeling like their role is in the home and their safetyhood is in the home. And that's like reinforcing this role of, you know, what the patriarchy wants to like keep perpetuating. So let's see, it looks like we have one more question that came in over Facebook. It says, how do white women unlearn the carceral logic that they rely on for their safety? Thinking about Brock Turner and the feedback he received from white feminists to lock him up for longer.
Yeah, this is the tough question, right? Like, this is where I think abolitionists have the most work to do in terms of their argument. Like, what do you do about violent behavior, right? In a world where we recognize the fundamental violence and injustice of police and policing, what do we do when our community, our friends, neighbors are actually victims of violent behavior? Right now, the United States, the way we view justice is retribution, right? You hurt a member of our community, the state's job is to go and hurt you back. It's not about reform. It's not about eliminating recidivism. It's not about teaching people another way. And it's not about helping the victim heal and move on, right? You know, one thing that I think is an important thing to keep in mind when we're having discussions about assault and violent behavior is how often the survivors of those assaults aren't believed, right? Or re-victimized during the trial, or re-victimized by the public after the trial, right? So even if, you know, Brock Turner goes in jail, the violence he did, right, she's still got to live with. The hate that came out towards her as a result, she's still got to live with. To me, that's not justice. That's not even close to justice. So how do we rethink justice in those instances, right? And this is where I go back to this notion of realism and disruption and healing. You know, what if instead of a justice system that was based on retribution, right, that justice system was based on restoration, right? Brock Turner's sentence was absolute bullshit. For everyone involved. But what if Brock Turner's sentence was he had to make restitution to that victim? Had to look her in the eye, had to apologize, had to go to therapy, had to go to school, had to find a way to make it right in his community. You know, when I think about a world without prisons, I think of a world full of schools instead, right? Where you have to learn about the damage you've done to a person and your community, and you have to find ways to fix it, and you have to work on yourself, you know? And so, yeah, like, that's the only real solution, or at least where my mind is headed, in terms of how we deal with violent behavior, is we have to stop seeing retribution as justice, right? And we have to start finding justice in ways that heal the people who are aggrieved and heal the community that was affected. And you don't do that by producing more violence. So that would be as close as I think I could come to a responsible answer without like really looking at the case again, but yeah.
Uyen, did you want to respond to that?
I just want to add as well, in terms of the question of like looking at a world without prisons, it is also going to require that we implement access to a lot of the education and the resources and needs that society needs in order to prevent people from committing these horrible crimes that are hurting community members and creating so much trauma. And you know, a lot of that is going into basically dismantling patriarchy as well, and dismantling and eradicating rape culture and all the other systems and ways in which we perpetuate that. And yeah, it does, a lot of this is going to be like radical love, radical support is something that's really going to be necessary within this as well. And that comes in so many different forms, but yeah, there's a lot to unpack here, truthfully. And really it comes to really viewing all the different things that perpetuate this kind of harm, and then also the prospect of healing and what radical healing is going to look like, and radical support for one another. Because like Antonio was saying, retribution is not what is going to solve these heinous crimes. And it's really going to be ways in which accountability is going to be taken, and also ways in which we can permanently prevent these harmful acts from being enacted in the future. And that is essentially going to be changing, like creating permanent behavioral change and cultural change if needed as well.
I also just wanted to direct people to the work of Survived and Punished. There's a few chapters, and so that work kind of looks at how survivors are actually end up being further incarcerated and criminalized within our current justice system, and you know, abolitionist perspectives to incarcerating folks that did harm like that, that might have been quote unquote violent, are currently exist today, right? And are being practiced across communities that have and a lot of you know, Black, migrant, queer communities that for a long time have had to rely on systems of care, of safety outside of the state, right? So a lot of those systems are currently in place. Survived and Punished is one organization to looking at the work of transformative justice, specifically Mia Minguez, the Bay Area Transformative Justice Center, the Anti-Police Terror Network in Oakland. There's just so many examples. So yeah, that's exciting that we're seeing some of them already in play, right? Were there other questions?
Yeah, there's a couple more. There was kind of a follow-up to the Brock Turner case, but I wanted to tie back to the climate. So one of the questions says, does the climate crisis contribute to greater resources being put into and or greater profits that are generated from the prison industrial complex?
I will go ahead and say, like, absolutely. I mean, the prison industrial complex allows so many different individuals, corporations, institutions to increase their profits from creating more and more prisons. It is really, the prison industrial complex is a huge corporation that is really putting so much money into the hands of those who are keeping it in place and are building more. And I think that's where a lot of this corruption kind of stems from. It's from those who want to continually ask for larger prisons, or basically bribe those who work within the state to create more prisons, because so many different corporations, individuals are profiting off of prison labor. So many corporations currently right now are using prison labor as well, and that's continually perpetuating capitalism and continually exploiting those who are incarcerated and those who are at risk of being incarcerated because of the communities and their identity. And this also brings into question all of the different emission rates that prisons also emit as well, and all of the different resources that they take up, such as the relocation of the Utah State Prison here. This is taking up so many resources, and it's going to be built on previously undeveloped land. And it's also going to be contributing to generations of pollution and emissions of fossil fuels, and the intake of our natural resources as well, just from maintaining the prison and through mass incarceration. I think there's just a multitude of ways in which mass incarceration and the prison industrial complex are really expediting climate change and bringing us closer to the tipping point, just due to the sheer harm that it does, not only environmentally, but socially and within our communities, and how all of those things are all intertwined. It's ultimately a domino effect. Mass incarceration, as it increases, is continually hurting our communities and people of color and our Black communities. And, you know, that is also linked to those who are going to be the most susceptible to receiving climate catastrophe, harms from climate catastrophe as well. And those things are linked, as well as those who are incarcerated are going to be the first to also experience a lot of climate risks that are occurring. We are seeing record-breaking temperatures occurring, especially within the Southwest. Every summer basically is setting new record highs of temperatures that are rising, and those who are incarcerated, and specifically those who are in solitary confinement, are the ones who are suffering the most due to it, because they're stuck in cages, they're stuck in concrete walls that are not allowing any kind of ventilation. And then on top of that, they're not having access to nature and to use their body in ways that affect and benefit their health, or having access to clean water, clean air, or quality food. So really, the creation of more prisons and the maintenance of more prisons is deeply harming basically every living thing in direct and indirect ways. And it is really just this interconnected, long-lasting web of things that are continually getting stuck within it, and that are being affected negatively by the prison industrial complex.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And, you know, another part of this is that the kind of capitalist drive to exploit, extract, and sell off our world piece by piece, it is contributing to real scarcity. Scarcity that isn't necessary. Scarcity in terms of lack of access to clean water, lack of access to clean air, clean land, right? Fish populations, crops, all of those, right, are becoming more and more difficult to produce to feed people. And it's not that the world doesn't have enough, right? This is not some like Malthusian fantasy where we can't feed everyone. We could, right? But the drive to own, control, and sell the world is what makes that scarcity happen, right? And scarcity is the number one cause of criminality. And as clean water, clean air, clean land gets more scarce, right? Those in power are gonna have to rely more and more on police and violence to control those populations. You know, and so I see this direct correlation between the exploitation of the planet and police violence. Because remember, police exist to control the poor. And the more of our planet that you exploit and destroy, the less there is for the poor. And the more poor people there will be. And so I think, you know, understanding that and finding ways to, I don't want to say conserve, because I know there's some issues with the conservationist approach to environmentalism, but to understand that the more we destroy, the less we have. And that is going to be a justification to police. That's going to be the justification to arrest. And we've already seen that sort of thing on the US-Mexico border, right? Where the discourse of environmentalism becomes a discourse that immigration and customs and the Border Patrol use to justify the violence they commit here. So there's definitely a link. And I think one way of helping to create safer communities that don't require or not that I think communities require policing now, but communities that are healthy without police, right? Part of that is understanding and changing the way that we relate to our environment. Absolutely.
Thank you for that, Antonio. And yes, I think just wanted to, can you all hear me? Okay, cool. Wasn't sure if I was broken. But yes, just wanted to reiterate that, yeah, a lot of these systems, whether it's, you know, a lot of the way that who is profiting from the climate crisis and who's profiting from war and displacement, right? And we know that it's a lot of the same folks. So we know that a lot of these systems are very interconnected, and both for like what was said earlier, both for abolitionists and for folks that are doing climate justice work, dismantling capitalism is a central component, right? And like Antonio said, protecting police, one of the primary functions of police is to protect property and protect the people who own those properties, right? So yes, those two things go hand in hand and can't be separated. So yeah, it was great to have kind of a space to make those connections and kind of go deeper into how geography, land, migration, war, imperialism are kind of interconnected and playing into our harmful world. Some of the things that folks are talking about in terms of, how do we build healthy communities? How do we shift from an extractive economy maybe to like a more regenerative economy? Those are things that we will we'll be highlighting and going deeper into our next webinars are part of this series. So this was panel number 3. There's 2 more coming up. So in the next 2 Saturdays, we'll again go deeper into some of the global connections that were talked about today would be for next week, and then going deeper until, okay, we know this world sucks, we know we don't want this, and we've seen wins, and how do we keep those wins going? So that'll be the last week in 2 Saturdays. Sorry, I don't have my calendar in front of me, so I don't know the date. Yeah, was there any more questions, housekeeping things before we kind of?
There's a couple more questions, and I just want to be mindful of timing because we're an hour and a half into this. Do we want to go into the questions? Do the panelists want to go into the next 2 questions, or? Okay, so the next question then is what could be an abolitionist perspective on cancel culture in the case of Brock Turner, for example?
I think I've been learning a lot more about basically the ways in which we should approach or stop upholding cancel culture, because cancel culture is essentially not allowing those who have harmed or who have done wrong to grow and to learn and to take full accountability and to actually change their behavior so that this behavior is not repeated in the future. And when cancel culture is basically embodied to it's stunting the person from allowing themselves to hold the space to reflect and move past this and learn past this as well. And I can understand why cancel culture is liked and why people want it. And it's really, there's a lot of gray area here, and it's definitely like a very heavy, deep issue to really unpack. And I think essentially cancel culture is going to be harmful because, like I was saying, it's not allowing for growth. It's not allowing for someone to reflect and learn past that. But I think we should also honor those who want to deplatform those who have harmed others and who are continually profiting off of the wrong that they have done. So I think there's certain ways to approach this, and essentially we really want to look at whether or not cancel culture or whatever hopes we have for those who have created harm whether those same things that we want from them are going to basically be beneficial and allow for growth to occur.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. You know, see, cancel culture functions on the same like retributive thought process and carceral logic, right, as does American policing. And that is, if you do something wrong, you are a bad person. And the only way to deal with bad people is to punish them, right? Now, I think first of all, you have to shift to identifying behaviors versus people, right? I don't think any of us is as good as the best thing we've ever done, and I don't think any of us is as evil as the worst thing we've ever done, right? And we've all done or engaged in behavior we're not proud of. So how do you find a way to produce accountability that allows for growth, right? And how do you deal with behavior, right? Instead of the value, right? The moral value of an individual. And so that's my issue with cancel culture, right? Is that it's about labeling bad people as irredeemable. And that's exactly how our justice system works, right? Once you're in, you're a criminal, right? Criminals belong in jail. And if you look at the way our system is set up, it's not to reform, it's not to rehabilitate, it's not to reintegrate into society, it's to punish. Now, I teach in a communication department. I teach about rhetoric, argumentation, and social activism. So for me, the answer is more speech, right? More engagement, not less. But you also have to remember that people pay a psychic toll for that, right? It's not everyone's responsibility, nor should people feel like it's their responsibility to fix someone else's bad behavior, right? But those of us who care and those of us who have the space to do it, right, we should be finding ways to have conversations that hold people accountable for their behavior online, right? And continue to hold them accountable, because that's the other part. When you cancel a person, you stop being part of that community that holds them accountable, right? And so I would say that would be where I'm at, is how do we find ways to keep each other accountable, especially in online spaces, right? Especially in forums where it's really hard to actually produce a nuanced thought, right? Or a critique. But that's where, especially now, that's the world we have to live in, right? So rather than policing online space, right? How do we build the kind of online space and community that allows people to grow and be better? And for me, that's this sort of stuff. That's conversation. And I also love to mix it up with people who I disagree with. You know, for me, having that argument, even if I know, right, that I'm not going to change anything, it's still an opportunity to disrupt. And if we go back to what I was talking about, like how I view movement work, it's about disruption and resilience. So if I can disrupt someone in their bad behavior, and then I can find a way to help my community build up a strength, a resilience from that moment, I think it's a much better use of our time than canceling.
Thank you. And we're getting close to running out of time, so I'm just going to ask one more question. I'm so sorry we can't get to all of them. How do you each personally engage with an environmental movement whose mainstream was created and continues to be dominated by wealthy white people? Do you think there's a value in working with established environmental groups that fit this profile, or do you avoid them? And I think that's a good question to kind of conclude this conversation and tie it back to environmentalism.
I think that's an awesome question. I tend to avoid mainstream environmental groups I have found myself in cases where I do work with them, oftentimes because of just the racial makeup, being the brown person, right? Being expected to handle brown outreach, or being the person who is expected to educate white allies, right, on white supremacy and racism, some of it that they don't even know is happening. That's not the kind of work I want to do. So as a result, I tend to avoid working with mainstream organizations. That said, like, I'm more of an activist than I am an organizer. I like a multiplicity of strategies, right? I think there is an important, though very annoying role for the moderate environmentalist. I think that we take our allies, imperfect as they are, and we use them to get what we need, right? And there is an important and special role for the radicals and the people who want to fuck shit up. And there's a role for the people who want to do nonprofit work. And there's a role for the people who want to do environmental work that's just in their community, you know? And we are not in a point right now where we can put down a tool, even if that tool annoys the hell out of us. And so while I personally don't do work with environmental groups, right? I appreciate that there are environmental groups doing that work, because I don't want to do that. Like, I don't want to be talking to Republican senators about environmental policy. Thank you very much. That would not be a good use of my time or my headspace. But there are people who can do that. And those are people I can talk to, right? Opportunities like this. So as long as everyone is pushing and using their gifts and their what makes them comfortable and what makes them special, right, towards a collective good, I'm all about it. However you want to disrupt, you know. So that's where I'm at.
I wanted to touch on Antonio talking about being the person of color within an environmentalist group and often being tokenized for being that person of color as well. And that is definitely something that occurs pretty commonly, not only within environmentalist groups, but in just various different activist and social justice groups as well, especially when they're predominantly going to be white run or predominantly run by white males. And for that reason, and also something I've been learning more about, which is the nonprofit industrial complex. There's a lot of like mainstream white environmentalist groups that I find are not, in my opinion, putting in the real work or really upholding values that are really actually going to help effectively combat climate change. When I see that mainstream, predominantly white environmentalist groups are not talking about the social justice aspects of climate justice, or talking about how racial inequity is actually a huge part of achieving or I guess when they're not talking about how racial justice is also a part of climate justice, then those are major red flags to me, because they're not truly approaching ways in which we can effectively combat climate change. And I think that, you know, I personally try to look for organizations that are going to be intersectional in this aspect, that they're really going to understand the full scope of all the tools, perspectives, and resources that are needed to really fight climate change and actually fight and achieve liberation. And so for me, there's kind of a mental list that I keep of things when I'm examining organizations to see whether or not they are in line with my same values, because social justice work is so heavily intertwined with climate justice, as we've been reiterating. And it's 2020, and still seeing that so many different organizations are not putting the money where their mouth is, or are ultimately like greenwashing their organization still, ironically, or throwing in just random social justice buzzwords to make them look like they're putting in the work when they really aren't putting in any real work is a huge issue. And so I think it's really important to really do the research deeply into the organization to see what steps they're taking, how they're holding themselves accountable as well in different platforms, and how they're actually going to be tackling climate justice in all different aspects and not just one narrow-minded method.
Thank you. Thank you for highlighting how important it is to kind of check in with the lineage of the organization. What are the values of the organization, and does that align with your own values? That's definitely very important, and will save you lots of headaches later on if you are a new organizer that is looking, or activist that is looking for a political home. The only piece I wanted to add too is that a lot of the reasons why these mainstream nonprofits are large is because they receive a lot of funding. And so another way to kind of support and think about that question is to, again, find organizations that are being led by the folks that are the most impacted, and maybe fund them and donate them instead, right? So also increasing visibility for that, and a huge, shout out to our host, Uplift Climate, that is, youth, Indigenous youth focused and led, and definitely not one of the, mainstream. It's a small org, so small orgs doing grassroots orgs need all the help and or funding support, redistribution support that we can get. So yes. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us. Those were, we did close out the Q&A right there. Before kind of going out into closing out, was there anything you wanted to add, Brinley, or any questions, last words?
I just wanted to remind everyone that we have 2 more webinars in this series coming up. So next week will be global perspectives, kind of looking beyond just the United States, and how we can learn from other actions beyond our own borders. And then the final week is going to be kind of talking more about successes and wins in the abolitionist movement, and what we have to look forward to, and how we can keep this energy alive, especially with all of the people who are renewed and kind of like activated by this moment. So be sure to sign up at that website, bit.ly/upliftabolition. Those are my final thoughts. If the panelists have any final closing words you want to end with,
I guess for me, it's just, there are lots of ways, right, to engage in this struggle to make the world a better place. If you're willing to find a spot, right, and you understand that what we're really trying to do here is create alternatives, and every one of us who starts asking questions and finding ways to make disruption happen, or having conversations, that is the work, right? It's not glamorous. It's oftentimes doesn't lead to like the big victories that we hope for, but that is what is changing right now. That's why, a year ago, 6 months ago, defunding the police, abolition, that was crazy talk. Right? That was not a conversation that people would take seriously. And now this is a real conversation. We are seeing cities moving to defund the police. We are seeing people asking questions about abolition. And so as long as we keep that language of resistance around, we're making progress.
Yeah, just adding on to that as well, like there are so many different ways in which you can continually show solidarity during this time. And a lot of that does come in small ways and oftentimes silent work as well. That's going to be behind the scenes. It's not going to be broadcasted. It doesn't have to be Instagrammed. And that is the real work that's going to be put in. It's not going to be for the Instagram likes or anything like that or to gain followers, but it's really work that is going to effectively disrupt and change the mindsets of those around you or help uplift others as well within this movement. And whether that's, again, like continually having these rough conversations, calling someone out when they're doing something problematic or racist, or also supporting individuals and become from a privileged position, donating and offering reparations in that way, or also getting involved with local mutual aid or grassroots initiatives as well, whether locally or nationally or on whatever level. Again, definitely do your research before you get involved with these, but there are so many ways to get involved. And I also just wanted to thank Uplift and Cecia and Brinley for hosting us and allowing us to share this space and talk about these things today. I really appreciate that, everyone who has joined today as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for offering us your wisdom. It was so informative for me to hear your perspective. So I really appreciate you spending the time. And somebody asked if this they'll have access to the recording. It is on both of our Facebook pages, on Uplift Climate as well as Decarcerate Utah's. And we will also be uploading it to our respective YouTube accounts. So we'll be sure to follow up with all of the people who signed up for this webinar to send that out. All right. I'll go ahead and let everyone sign off then. Thanks everyone for joining, and hope you all have a wonderful rest of your Saturday.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next week.